Yes, the publishers of the Costello memoirs have just released the paperback edition with 2 new chapters from the former Treasurer. Peter Costello came into our studios just a short time ago to talk about his memoirs and the state of the party. Peter Costello, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Tony.
OK, the Auditor General's report on the fake email scandal is coming out tomorrow. What were you thinking when you watched this whole catastrophe unfold for Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, of course, I wasn't in the country. I was actually in Israel on an exchange with the Australian Parliament.
I'm sure you were kept in touch.
So the only information I was getting was through colleagues that were getting messages from Australia, and of course we were a long way away. It didn't look good. It looked like one of those political eruptions that occur from time to time, where the story gets curiouser and curiouser. It's not the first time that there have been forged or fake documents, by the way. 1996, on the eve of the election, Ralph Willis produced some against me. And of course there was the debacle which I relate in my book about the 2007 election with the leaflet in Lindsay. So these things happen, but it did seem to be one of those spectacular eruptions of federal politics.
Could this be as damaging for Malcolm Turnbull as the Lindsay leaflet scandal was for the party and the government just before the election?
Well, the Lindsay leaflet was really the knockout final blow, I think, in that election. I think we probably would have lost anyway, but we lost the last 48 hours of the campaign, and I think we lost more seats than we otherwise would have if it hadn't have been for that disaster. Look, plainly this is not good. Malcolm Turnbull has said that this is not good. But it's important for him, I think, that he gets over it and gets back on to issues which are of more importance to the Australian public.
You'd agree that this was the thing, this fake email scandal that basically took the wind out of his leadership sails, because he was going OK before that?
Well, look, it wasn't a success, and he's admitted that it wasn't a success, and I think, as he said on the program tonight, he wants to put it behind him.
Do you think it's possible, though? I mean, you saw that program. I mean, what was your assessment of that as a piece of, well, damage control, reportage? I mean,
well, if I was doing damage control, Tony, I wouldn't have had the press crawling all over my office when this disaster happened. I think that's probably magnified it, because now there's glorious footage of what was actually occurring in the office, but it's too late to think of those things now. Look, it's happened. It turned out that the material was forged. He's withdrawn on the basis of that. He's got to put it behind him.
Does the affair, the Godwin-Grech affair, still have the capacity to damage further his leadership? And we're about to get a report from the Auditor General. I mean, there's more that we don't know about. We've now learned that he was the one himself as leader who met with Godwin-Grech before he dropped the bombshell in the Senate hearings.
Look, I think really most of what can be known will be known. Yeah, unless there's some knockout new development. Suppose the author of the email suddenly appears from somewhere. That would be a knockout new development. But unless there's some knockout new development, then I think what can be known is already out there. I think people have made up their minds. And I think, as Malcolm said, it's time for him to move on. Now, of course, who doesn't want to move on? Well, Kevin Rudd doesn't want to move on, that's for sure. He'll keep on coming back to it. But
you've seen the analysis, though. Did you regard it as a sign of Malcolm Turnbull's inexperience as a leader and his impetuosity?
Look, when you're under pressure and these things appear, you can get overexcited by them. Look, I'll give you my example. 1996, Ralph Willis walks into a press conference. He says, I've got this document from Jeff Kennett to John Howard that shows that there's a secret agenda to cut health funding in this country. Now, I knew that I'd never been party to any such thing. And we rang up Jeff Kennett. We said, did you ever write such a thing? And the minutes ticked by very slowly as he went through his records. But it paid to go through your records to make sure you're on very firm ground before you go into these things. That's an example.
But that's the position the government's in, not the position that Malcolm Turnbull's in. And they're the ones that went through the records and found this was fake. He's the one who's asked for the Prime Minister to resign on the basis of a faked email.
Well, that's my point. You know, maybe with the benefit of hindsight, he should have done more due diligence on this email and asked some more questions about its provenance. Okay, with the benefit of hindsight. But okay, we all know the fact it wasn't a true email. Okay, that's that chapter closed. Move on. That's my advice.
All right, let's go to your book. In the new postscript, you take us back to that surprising day in Parliament when your retirement was announced. Now, Malcolm Turnbull did say some very nice things about you, but the real story was his body language, the barely suppressed glee. Did you find that odd?
This, by the way, was the week before Utegate.
Yeah.
So I announced that I was not running at the next election. Malcolm very generously got up in the Parliament, said some nice things, as did Kevin Rudd, incidentally. And then that weekend I left to go to Israel on a parliamentary delegation. That was the fateful week of Utegate.
Well, some people have actually blamed you for this whole thing.
Yes, some have.
Your departure emboldened Malcolm Turnbull in such a way that he did something, well, let's say silly.
Yeah, well, I think I could be blamed for most things in Australian politics.
Have you been blamed by anyone in the party?
Well, yeah, some people have suggested that there was a connection, but let me tell you this: it was more peaceful in Ramallah that week than it was back in the Australian Parliament. I was quite glad to be meeting the Palestinian Foreign Ministry. Whilst colleagues of mine were getting little emails back from Australia. But to go back to your question, because this is the postscript to the book.
The barely suppressed glee was the question. Were you surprised?
I was surprised. I stood on my feet. I wasn't prepared to give a speech that particular day, and I looked down at the gleaming dispatch box, Kevin Rudd gleaming and Malcolm Turnbull gleaming, and I said, I never thought I'd see the day where I would make both sides of Australian politics happy.
You certainly did that. But were you surprised then by reports that it went a little further than that, this tribal sort of thing, that after your announcement that you were quitting politics, Malcolm Turnbull's son Alex, quote, donned a cowboy hat, straddled a broom and ran around the office screaming yeehaw?
I was a little surprised by that. I think he could have straddled something better than a broom, don't you?
I mean, it's what politics is all about, though, isn't it? I mean, there is this thing, looking over your shoulder at the next most ambitious person in the room and wondering if inevitably they are going to come and take away what you value most, your leadership. I mean, you've experienced this yourself.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd say that Malcolm actually has been very fortunate when you think about it, because really he came to the leadership by winning a ballot against Brendan Nelson. Brendan, to his great credit, accepted that with very good grace. And I think you can say Malcolm, of all people in the Liberal Party, has been entirely absent of anybody having designs upon his position. And so I think in that sense, he certainly hasn't had to go through what Brendan had to go through. But to come back to the point, as I write in my book, politics is as hard to get out of as the Australian Test cricket team. They used to say it was harder to get out of the Test cricket team than it was to get into it. Look, it's a great life. There are moments of great high. Elections, budgets, policies. I used to love the debate on the floor of the chamber. And that adrenaline-soaked life is very hard to give up. Very few people walk away from politics. Very few indeed. Most are taken out either by their own party or they're taken out by the electorate. In the end, what took John Howard out was his own constituents voted him out.
And hubris, no?
Well, his constituents ended his career. He lost his seat.
True.
We all came back to Canberra after the election and endured the taunts and the arrows. He didn't come back because his constituents had taken him out. And so I write in the book about how I had determined very early in my life it's better to get out before your constituents or your pre-selectors or the press take you out. I was in politics, have been in politics for 20 years. I've had a pretty good run, and I wanted to go at the time of my choosing.
What do you think will take Malcolm Turnbull out? He's now polling at 16% as preferred Prime Minister. I think that's actually worse than Brendan Nelson when he was effectively taken out by Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, there's a sort of, you know, animal kind of logic to this whole thing, isn't it? Eventually, even though he hasn't had anyone sort of looking to take over his leadership, that's the way it works, isn't it?
Well, look, the next Malcolm